Hi everybody, welcome to this lesson video on the Iroquois, my most favorite of the Native American culture groups for so many reasons. And this video is going to be based on your CR4 reading, the Iroquois. And I want to start by pointing out two key ideas from this reading. The first one is that women were powerful, well-respected members of Iroquois society. We'll be taking a closer look at that in a few minutes. And the fact that these 5 Iroquois tribes were joined together into a league or a confederacy for peace and protection. And this was somewhat unique, maybe not unique, but certainly unusual among the Native Americans. It was the most powerful Indian confederacy on the continent. And at its peak, this Iroquois confederacy, at the peak of its power, the Iroquois could literally negotiate with European countries as if they were their own nation. So let's do a quick review of the Iroquois culture. They were part of the Eastern Woodlands culture region. They lived in an area with forests, rivers, lakes, abundant natural resources. Apart from the cold winters, this was a pretty great place to live. And they were farmers who did some hunting and some gathering. Their most important crop was corn. Here's a diagram of an Iroquois village, but hidden in this diagram are some important clues about the Iroquois way of life. And the first clue can be found in the design of the lawn house, which tells us a lot about the Iroquois family. Lawn houses were made of wooden poles covered with bark. They had holes in the roof for smoke to escape. They were pretty amazing structures, and not far from here, in Ganondigan, about a 30-minute drive, descendants of the Iroquois have reconstructed a lawn house that you can actually visit. So let's take a peek inside. Now, I've personally visited this lawn house in the month of November, and I can tell you it's quite cozy inside. Down the length of the lawn house are a series of campfires, or places to start a campfire for cooking. And the fires are directly across from these beds or cubbies. And each one of these cubbies was shared by a family, a mother, a father, and children. So you would have one family here, and then one cubby down would be another family, and then another family. And the fire would be shared by the families across from each other. So this would be a family, and they would share the fire with this family. And these families were called fireside families. Today we would call them nuclear families. It's a very technical term that people who study family structures and culture surrounding the family would use that term, nuclear family, mother, father, children. Although in today's world, we know we have all kinds of different families. Sometimes it's just mother and children. Sometimes it's just father and children. Sometimes it's grandparents and children. But the basic unit, you, the children, the child, and your caregiver, that's what we would call today the nuclear family. So in Iroquois culture, the nuclear family was called the fireside family. But even more important than these fireside families were the lawn house families, which we would call today the extended family. So let's look at that term, nuclear versus extended. We already talked about mother, father, children, which would include your brothers and sisters. That would make up your nuclear family. Your extended family includes all those other people who give you presents at Christmas, right? Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. And in Iroquois culture, the extended family was called the lawn house family. And most of the members of the lawn house family, but not all, lived together in this lawn house, in one huge house. Notice there's going to be very little privacy here. And really the only separation, the only barrier between you and your extended family is just a few feet of space in the lawn house. Whereas in our culture, in our society today, the extended family, well, those are people that you don't see every day. But for members of the Iroquois, their extended family were the people that they lived with on a daily basis in the lawn house. But there were some big differences between the Iroquois family and our families today. And these differences show the importance of women in Iroquois culture compared to men. The Iroquois were matrilineal, which means their family history was traced only through their mother's side. And this is going to have some bizarre effects on the family that are going to seem very unusual to us today. So one of the results of this is you're considered to be a member of your mother's extended lawn house family, not your father's. Your dad's extended family is not considered to be your family. So when you are born, you're automatically born into your mother's lawn house family, and you stay with her in the lawn house. If you are a boy, you stay in the lawn house until you get married, and then they kick you out and you have to go live in your wife's lawn house, but you're still considered to be a member of your mother's lawn house family. If you're a girl, then you live in that lawn house for life. And when you get married, your husband has to come and live with you in the lawn house with your family. Some other effects of being matrilineal and living together with your extended family in the lawn house are that your mom's sisters, your aunts who lived with you in the lawn house, were also called mom. Now, you probably knew who your real mother was, and you made that distinction between mom and mom sisters, but the term mom was used for all of them because your mom and you might live here, but your mom's sister might live here, and her other sister might live here with her children. And her children would be called brother and sister, whereas today we would call those children cousins. Your mom's sister's children in our society, our culture, are called cousins, but for the Iroquois, they were called brother and sister. And that kind of makes sense because they're all living together in the lawn house. So the children were raised by all of the women of the lawn house. But again, you probably understood that your mom was, a little more special, your real mom, your birth mother. Now, the head of the lawn house was a woman. She was called the chief mother, and she was the oldest, most respected woman in the lawn house. Further evidence that women were powerful and well-respected members of Iroquois society. It was also the women who picked the male leaders of the tribe, the sachems. Women picked the leaders of the tribe, who were men, but they could also fire those men if the men were not listening to the advice of the women. Other evidence that women were powerful and well-respected members of Iroquois society we can find in the Iroquois myths and legends. Their god was a woman. Sky Woman was the creator of the earth. And I think a lot of this, maybe even all of it, goes back to the fact that it was the women who did the farming. And it was farming that produced most of the food for the village. So when your number one food source is being produced by women, and you're relying on women for your number one food source, it makes sense that women came to be very well respected and powerful in Iroquois culture and Iroquois society. So let's go back to our diagram of an Iroquois village for another clue about Iroquois culture. And the clue is this wooden fence called a stockade, which always ran around the outside of an Iroquois village. We'll take another look here. This diagram shows that not only did it run all the way around the village, sometimes it even wrapped around twice. Now, this picture probably doesn't do it justice. We don't have real photographs of Iroquois villages from the 1600s and the 1700s, but we do have eyewitness descriptions, which these Europeans who first saw these villages didn't know what to make of them. They were so huge. They described the stockade as being so elaborate, with platforms on top of the stockade, platforms on top of platforms to attack anyone on the outside. And often the village being located next to a river or a stream, the Europeans, they used the term castle. They called the Iroquois villages castles because that was the closest thing they could think of in comparison to what they knew from back in Europe with European castles from the Middle Ages. And the reason for all this was that the Iroquois were very violent. They were not the peaceful farmers that we are sometimes led to believe. Warfare in Iroquois society was very, very frequent. In the beginning, among the Iroquois themselves, and then later among their neighbors. And you can see from these pictures that the first European explorers also described the Iroquois as wearing armor, wooden armor. They would have these war clubs, bows and arrows, and later on guns, which they would get from the Europeans by trading with them. And one of the strangest customs that the Iroquois had that was related to warfare was something called mourning wars. Now, the term mourning here, mourning, we're not talking about it's morning out, the sun's up. We're talking about mourning as in crying, mourning someone close to you who has died. And the reason why they were called mourning wars is when the Iroquois lost someone important from the tribe, they would go out and lead a raid against an enemy tribe and capture prisoners who they would then torture really, really viciously, bring back to the Iroquois village. And any of the prisoners who showed a sign of weakness, if they couldn't handle the torturing, they would just be killed. But they would pick the prisoners who showed the most bravery, and then they would adopt them into the tribe, and they would become Iroquois to replace the other Iroquois in the villages who had died. And later on in the 1600s, there was a whole series of wars against the Iroquois' enemies, between the Iroquois and their enemies. And at this time, a lot of diseases had been brought by the Europeans into the Iroquois villages by accident. These are European diseases which quickly spread among the Indians once the explorers arrived. And the Europeans described, like, some of these Iroquois villages, almost half the people weren't even Iroquois. They were people who had been adopted into the tribe through this mourning war process. So the Iroquois thought of New York State as one giant lawn house. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the different tribes of the Iroquois were fighting with each other until they formed this confederacy, which came to be known as the League of Five Nations, also called the Great League of Peace, or just the Iroquois Confederacy. But don't let the term peace mislead you. Even though the Iroquois joined together into this league for peace among themselves, they still continued to wage warfare against their neighbors. The five Iroquois tribes were the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk. And the Seneca Indians are the Iroquois Indians who would have lived in our area near Rochester and Lake Ontario. The Iroquois called themselves the Haudenosaunee. The word Iroquois is actually, I believe, a French term, and it's sort of an insulting term for the Iroquois. It means rattlesnake people. So if you ever meet someone who's an Iroquois, show them the respect of using their own name for themselves, the Haudenosaunee. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the different Iroquois tribes were actually at war with each other. So when I say in the beginning, I mean probably before the year 1400 or so. As the legend goes, along came two men, Hiawatha and Dagondawida. Hiawatha was a Mohawk Indian. Dagondawida came from an entirely different tribe. But the one thing that they had in common is they wanted to stop the warfare among the Iroquois. They had an enemy, and his name was Tadodaho. And in the legends, he had snakes growing out of his head, like he had snakes for hair. And he was an Onondaga chief who did not want peace. But eventually, as the story goes, Dagondawida and Hiawatha were able to convince him to join together with the other tribes of the Iroquois into this great league of peace. And as the legend describes, what they did in the legend was they combed the snakes out of Tadodaho's hair, which is why the comb is actually a powerful symbol of peace among the Iroquois. And if you go to that lawn house that I told you about in Ganondagan, there's a visitor center there. And if you go into the visitor center, in cases along the wall, they have all these hand-carved combs carved out of mostly bone. And that is why, because the comb is a symbol of peace, because they combed the snakes out of Tadodaho's hair. Now, probably what they actually did is they said, look, if you and your tribe, the Onondaga, join us, we'll let you be the leader of this Iroquois Confederacy. And that is what ended up happening. Tadodaho became the leader, and down through the years, long after his death, the leader of the Iroquois Confederacy was still called Tadodaho. It's like calling someone Mr. President, Mr. Tadodaho. So here are some notes on the Iroquois Confederacy that you'll find on page 4 in your unit packet. The Iroquois Confederacy is also sometimes called the League of Five Nations. I've heard it referred to either way. Especially on the Regents exam in social studies, it could be referred to as either. You can expect either term if you get a test question on the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, when did all this happen? Sometime before the first Europeans arrived in Iroquois territory, probably in the middle part of the 1400s. The Confederacy, the term Confederacy, means that the five nations cooperated with each other, but they were still They kept their own identity. They were still independent. It was only when issues affected all the nations together as a whole that they came together to make those decisions as a Grand Council. And the Grand Council was made up of 50 Iroquois chiefs, 10 from each of the different 5 Iroquois nations. All of the council decisions had to be unanimous, which means all 50 of the chiefs had to agree for something to happen. Now, the who we already talked about. In legend, the Iroquois Confederacy was formed by Hiawatha, Degandawida, and eventually Tadodaho once they were able to convert him to ways of peace. And Tadodaho became the firekeeper, or the head of the Grand Council. And of course, this was occurring in New York State. And as I mentioned earlier, the Iroquois really pictured New York State as one big lawn house, which is why they called the Seneca the keepers of the western door. The Mohawk were called the keepers of the eastern door. And in the middle, the Onondaga, who were located near present-day Syracuse, were called the keepers of the Council of Fire, because that is where the Grand Council for the League of Five Nations met. So to summarize some of the key ideas from this video, we saw that women were powerful, well-respected members of Iroquois society. Some evidence of this is that the Iroquois were matrilineal. Their family history was traced through the mother's side only. The head of the Iroquois lawn house was the chief mother, and it was the women who picked the male leaders of the tribe and could fire them if the men did not follow the women's advice. And it was also the women who did the farming, which means they produced most of the food for the village. We also saw that the 5 Iroquois tribes were joined together into a league or confederacy for peace and protection. The Iroquois were very warlike. They often waged war against their neighboring tribes. And then 2 Iroquois leaders, Hiawatha and Degandawida, who became known as the Peacekeeper, helped join those 5 Iroquois tribes together into a confederacy, which was extremely powerful. And it was the Iroquois Confederacy which allowed the Iroquois to hold their ground against European countries like England and France after the first explorers arrived in America.